Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. On the show tonight,
one homicide is one too many.
Why is Chicago seeing more violence than it did in 2020? How some groups are working toward anti-violence solutions.
There's a lot of gaps.
More than $1 billion is going to rent relief in Illinois, but is it enough to stave off a rush of evictions? The budget, pension fixes, and ethics. State lawmakers have just 2 weeks to hammer out some big issues. We'll hear from 4 of them. The Supreme Court is set to hear a major abortion case that some say could threaten Roe v. Wade. We look at that case and others before the court. As daycares reopen, are kids coming back? We check in on child care in Illinois.
I'm Angel Ito and currently standing in the home of the Jackson 5. We'll hear from some members of that family later on tonight.
We'll look forward to that. But first, some of today's top stories. Fully vaccinated Chicagoans won't be required to wear a mask in most instances, bringing the city in line with new federal and state guidance. This coming today from Chicago Public Health Commissioner Dr. Allison Arwady. Masks will still be required in healthcare and congregate settings, on public transit, and in city buildings.
We continue to strongly advise, though not require, masking policies for all indoor settings in Chicago until COVID capacity restrictions are lifted and we are in phase 5. This advisory applies to any setting that does not have the capacity to check vaccination status and/or where employees, clients, or attendees are not all known to be vaccinated.
Meanwhile, state health officials announced nearly 1,500 new cases of coronavirus, including 21 additional deaths. The total number of COVID cases is more than 1.3 million, with 22,466 deaths. And the state's test positivity rate is now down to 2.8%. That means Lollapalooza is officially back. The 4-day music festival will run July 29th through August 1st in Grant Park without capacity limits. But attendees will have to be fully vaccinated or show proof of a negative COVID test in the past 24 hours. A lineup of bands is set to be released at 10 a.m. tomorrow. And Navy Pier announces its full reopening, targeted for Memorial Day weekend. And that tourist destination's summer programming is scheduled to start on Friday the 28th, with the return of its popular Saturday night fireworks the following day. The Pier's outdoor spaces began opening last month. Indoor spaces will open to the public on Thursday. And the city announces locations for its Chicago Al Fresco effort. That's an expansion of last year's popular outdoor dining program. 15 community organizations around the city were chosen as partners for the first round. They'll be able to use grant money to transform streets, sidewalks, and other public spaces to allow for dining, performances, and other community activities. Well, Chicago is seeing more violence than it did in 2020, although homicides have tailed off recently after a spike earlier this year. Just last weekend, more than 48 people were shot, including a 2-year-old girl, a 13-year-old boy, and 2 Chicago police officers. And Memorial Day weekend is right around the corner, which is a notoriously violent time in the city. Joining us to discuss this is Benneth Lee, a criminal justice studies instructor at Northeastern Illinois University and co-founder of the National Alliance for the Empowerment of the Formerly Incarcerated. Lee is also a former gang member. And Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain, the executive director of Live Free Illinois. Welcome both of you to Chicago Tonight. It's good to have you. So we'll take a look at some of the numbers this year. Some categories of crime are down, but if you look at murder, it's up 22% from 160 last year to 195 this year. Sierra, there's so many things that cause violence. Is there anything that you could attribute a spike this year to?
I would say, one, we know the cause of violence, racism, poverty, and neglect. But with COVID-19, we know that like Black communities were really hit, disproportionately hit by COVID-19. So the trauma that was put on Black communities through COVID-19 just exacerbated the issue of gun violence. And not only just the trauma, but just, again, when you're continually neglecting communities, they don't have the resources to cope through other pandemics. This was something just waiting to collide. So I would attribute all of those contributing factors to why violence increased.
All of those things. And Bennett, you know, we've heard reports in the last several months about retaliatory shootings. We have kids getting shot as young as infants, getting caught up in crossfire. Do you see this as mostly gang activity or interpersonal activity?
It's mostly interpersonal activities. You know, you may have a guy that's part of a street gang, but have a personal vendetta against another individual, and then he retaliate. It might come out because the person was gang affiliated, they say it's gang related. But I don't think these are shootings that a gang came together and say, we're gonna do this and we're gonna move together. I think it's a lot of, you know, people just don't know how to go to another person and say, I need to talk with you, let's work this out. Everybody afraid of each other. I'm afraid of what the next man might do, so I'm gonna do it before they do it to me. And people are afraid to communicate. So I think it's more individual versus gangs doing a lot of shootings.
Right, and you were on the show a few weeks ago saying that people just don't feel safe, even more now than in years prior. Let's take a look at what Police Superintendent David Brown had to say about the escalating violence yesterday.
So what we want to do is proceed with an all hands on deck during the peak hours of when all of what we think will happen. You know, think about the last global pandemic we had in this country. What followed was the Roaring '20s. And you know, I don't know if you've read F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So if all that pent up energy, because we've been quarantined, explodes with all of this, you know, people being out, more people being active in the outdoors, we want to make sure it's safe.
A lot of folks weary of the coming summer months. Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain, the mayor, said there would be, quote, 200,000 opportunities, either summer jobs or recreation for youth. Do you think that's enough to tamp down what typically is a spike in violence in the summer months as kids are not in school?
No, that is not enough. It wasn't enough in previous years, and as we just heard, you named the numbers where we're up 22% in homicides and shootings, and so there needs to be a large investment in a comprehensive strategy in addressing gun violence. So doing the bare minimum or doing business as usual is not acceptable, and there must be a larger investment. And we know that there are opportunities that present themselves, especially with the American Rescue Plan dollars, where there's funding available to invest in street outreach, hospital-based intervention, trauma service, mental health services that are led by Black and brown clinicians. So there is an opportunity to really make a serious investment in reducing violence in this critical moment.
So all those wraparound services, not just jobs or recreation, but mental health and violence intervention. And Bennett, that is part of what you do. The U of C Crime Lab put out a report deducing that one of the things that's happening this year are more people are carrying firearms in years past. It just keeps going up every year. Does that square with what you're seeing, just more people in possession of weapons?
Yeah, especially young people. See, these young people, because they don't have the means to legitimately get a Ford card or get concealed carry, but they carrying a gun the same reason why a regular citizen would carry a gun, to protect themselves, afraid that they may get victimized. So you got young people getting these guns and getting them illegal because they probably got some little infringement on their background where they can't legally get a Ford card or concealed carry, but when they get caught with the gun, they get penalized, right? But it's a lot of fear out there with people working, God-fearing people is afraid. They're getting guns to carry. So is these young people, and they are the target because it's their peers are the ones that's getting shot, and it's their peers that's doing the shooting. So they're more afraid than the regular citizens, so they're getting these guns.
Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain, do you hear that from young people that you work with, that they're afraid and they feel that they need the arm to just even stay alive sometimes?
I mean, I hear that from young people, and I hear that from adults. And we know that from the COVID numbers that there was an increase in gun sales and ammunition. So if you have communities flooded with firearms, then there is this piece of folks feel unsafe. So if everyday people were going out and purchasing firearms, why are Black and brown communities scrutinized for also feeling unsafe in their communities as well?
And Bennett, you know, we mentioned that Memorial Day can be a particularly violent weekend, as are holiday weekends in the summer. We hear about police strategies, but they never seem to really do anything. Is there any police strategy that can tamp down a violent weekend, or is this something that's just going to keep happening until the broader issues are solved?
Well, I think we put too much on the police to calm this down. This got to come from the community, these families, brothers that got these relationships, you know, like myself, as you mentioned, I was a former gang leader. I do my part, going back in that old neighborhood where I come from, build a relationship with them little brothers, get them to look at things, because I believe the more they talk to each other, it'll be hard for them to shoot each other, and they'd be more apt to work things out. It's got to come from the community. We just can't put it all on the police.
All right, well, we thank you very much for your perspectives. Our thanks to Bennett Lee and Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain. Thanks so much. For 14 months, there's been a ban on evictions here in Illinois, but that is set to change later this summer. Amanda Vinicky joins us now for a look at housing in the pandemic's quote-unquote bridge phase. Amanda, what did you find out?
Well, Paris, that ban on evictions has taken various forms, going from a total prohibition to now, where evictions are only allowed in the strictest of circumstances, like when a judge deems somebody to be a dangerous threat.
So there are limited exceptions to the moratorium. The problem is that while the moratorium has prevented evictions, which is extremely important, and that's really a public health issue, it has not relieved tenants of the responsibility to pay the rent that's been accruing. They still have that debt.
Lawrence Wood is an attorney with the Legal Aid Chicago's housing practice group, and he says that a new state program is going to go a long way there. Illinois is going to spend $1.5 billion of federal money to pay back rent that is owed by residents of limited means, priority going to those who've been unemployed. They and their landlords apply online, and then the money goes straight to the landlords. Michael Meany represents Chicago landlords and says that is going to really help to prevent a huge wave of evictions once that moratorium is lifted.
We really don't think that there is going to be this, what's been described as a tsunami of evictions once the moratorium ends.
But Wood says that this program has limitations.
First of all, we don't know if $25,000 is going to satisfy the debt. I mean, people haven't been paying rent since the pandemic started back in March.
Paul Arena represents small and medium-sized landlords, and when I asked him whether this new relief program is the cure, he did not hesitate to tell me no. He points to a couple first-time landlords renting to people who stopped paying rent before the pandemic, but then the eviction moratorium kicked in before they could do anything about it. The relief money is only supposed to cover renters with COVID-related hardships, so they may not qualify, even though they had to abide by the eviction ban. Now, tenants also have to cooperate with landlords to apply for the funding.
If a tenant just moves out, right? Say they stayed for a year and then just move out, there's no assistance for those landlords. They have no option right now. So there's a whole list of things that areas where there are obvious deficiencies in the programs that can be addressed.
When Governor J.B. Pritzker announced this program, he also said that the eviction moratorium is going to come to an end this summer, being phased out, then stopping in August. Mike Meany says that this is welcome and sensible news for landlords. He says evictions should be a last resort, but he hopes that Pritzker will now loosen the conditions so that evictions are allowed in circumstances unrelated to COVID and non-payment.
To allow for cases to move forward against residents that are again, breaking the rules, whatever it might be, causing problems, being a danger to other residents of the building.
Now, North Suburban Legal Aid Clinic's Director of Housing Law Practice, Maureen Kim, says she works with a lot of people who've been in touch with her, who, through no fault of their own, she says, have been unable to pay their rent throughout the pandemic. Now she says that it is important that Illinois be mindful before completely lifting that ban.
We just want to make sure that all of this money that is out there to provide rental assistance gets distributed fully before the moratorium is lifted. And you know, the online application process does take some time before it is approved and the money is distributed.
Now, meanwhile, the governor also signing a law that seals evictions records from March of 2020, really when the pandemic began, through March of next year, so 2022. Kim says that this is an important protection so that a huge number of tenants won't be blacklisted from future apartments.
Mere filing of an eviction case goes on a tenant's screening report, and a future landlord will see that and not want to rent to them.
Now, but Arena says, take it from a landlord's perspective.
They're destroying the credit of the landlords, right? Those landlords who haven't been able to pay their bills because they had no income, their credit is going to be wrecked, but nobody's worried about their records. So this whole approach has been so one-sided, it's frustrating.
And he says that if you don't have landlords providing housing opportunities, that is going to cause another crisis, a further lack of affordable housing. We could see some more housing action in Springfield before the month's end because the pandemic has really brought a lot of attention to these issues. With that, Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. State lawmakers have until the end of May to wrap up some major issues, including the eviction moratorium dilemma you just heard about, as well as hammering out the state's budget and dealing with ballooning pensions. Here to talk about that and much more are State Senator Jason Barrickman, a Republican from Bloomington, State Representative Tom Demmer, a Republican from Dixon, State Representative Anna Moeller, a Democrat from Elgin, and State Representative LaShawn Ford, a Democrat from the west side of Chicago. Welcome all of you back to Chicago tonight. I want to start with that eviction moratorium. Representative Ford, about $1.5 billion in aid here for renters that might be months behind on their rent. Is that enough to help some of those renters that are really struggling out there?
It's not enough, but it is needed. And I think that we will find that because the governor and the federal government and Springfield came together as a group bipartisanly to make this happen, I think we're in good shape to remedy some of the problems.
So the moratorium will ease out once it ends in August. Senator Barrickman, what about for landlords? And we know renters have struggled for a long time, but if they're not paying, that means lots of landowners are not getting income to pay their mortgages or the costs that they have. Is there anything to help them out?
Well, yeah, and I think everybody's going to breathe a sigh of relief as this thing starts to get back to normal. You know, there's eviction cases that have been stuck in court for months or longer. That process will start. I think it's going to be a bit overwhelming for the courts, but we've got to see it begin. There's going to be required cooperation between landlords and tenants to be able to get some of this relief that's available. So again, I think there's going to be a bit of a sigh of relief that with us as a nation moving beyond the COVID pandemic, we're also going to begin to see some normalcy between the landlord and tenant relations, though it'll probably be slow to start.
All right, I want to get to this always tense redistricting fight. Of course, redrawing the legislative maps happens every 10 years. There have been a couple reports of purported drafts of new maps drawn mainly by Democrats that would wipe out 2 GOP-held congressional districts. Representative Moeller, where is this remap process right now?
Well, right now, we in the House and the Senate are in an information gathering phase of looking at the new maps. As you know, we're required by the Constitution to redraw the maps after every decennial census, and that's that process we're going through. We've held several public hearings throughout the state to gather information and hear from local mayors, private citizens, advocates, other people who are interested in good government to gather information to use to help draw those maps. And so right now we've collected a lot of that data, and we're working through the process to put together a proposal for new maps for the entire state.
Representative Demmer, Governor Pritzker on the campaign trail said that he would veto any map that wasn't drawn by an independent commission. He's kind of gone back on that. Do you believe this process is independent, bipartisan, is taking in the views of all sides here?
This process is clearly not independent, and it's not bipartisan. This process is exactly the same as we've seen in previous years, in which we have an attempt by legislators to pick their voters instead of the other way around. The reason the Constitution calls on us to draw new maps after a decennial census is so we can use that new census data to draw the maps. That data is not being used this time for the first time in Illinois redistricting history. Instead, estimated survey data is being used in order to preserve a political partisan advantage instead of using more accurate data.
So because that census report came in late, that Democrats are purportedly using a different set of data to base their maps on. Representative Ford, why not wait until that census data is there before drawing the maps?
Well, I think we have, by Constitution, we need to get this done. And that's the goal, to get it done by the constitutional mandate. I think that no matter how we put it, it will be very tough to have an agreement on the maps with Republicans and Democrats. So I think that we have to move forward.
Senator Barrickman, might the GOP bring legal action if there is a map that, again, is based on the American Community Survey and not based on the census?
Look, I think the many witnesses that have been heard from during these public hearings that the Democrats, have, pointed to, those witnesses have said that they intend to sue because the use of bad data results in Voting Rights Act's violation of the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. So I think we'll see lawsuits from those groups. But here's what's most important, Paris. Governor Pritzker promised to voters as a candidate that he was going to veto any map drawn by partisans. Well, we're seeing just that process take place. It's being reported that it's done in a secret room. The governor could stop all of this. He's the one person in the state who has an ability, through his megaphone and through his veto pen, to keep the promise that he made to voters and to veto this map. Unfortunately, I think Governor Pritzker is going to join a long line of politicians who say one thing as a candidate and do something else as when they have the ability to lead on it. And that's just really unfortunate that he's unwilling to keep his promise on this.
All right, well, this is obviously a very contentious issue, but we have a lot to get to. Representative Mueller, I wanted to touch on a bill for an elected school board for Chicago Public Schools. There's one backed by the teachers union that would have 21 elected members. There's one backed by Mayor Lightfoot that would give the mayor the power to appoint most of the members, the so-called hybrid board. The president of the Senate has asked for a sort of a compromise on this. Where do you think a compromise might end up?
Well, look, I represent a district that has all elected school boards as part of the local landscape. So I understand the desire for parents and voters in Chicago to want to be able to elect their school board members. And I think the proposal that was put forth by Representative Ramirez was a good proposal. And it was crafted after many months of negotiations and discussions with parents, the union, school board officials, and others. The proposal that the mayor put forth scaled back the number of seats that were actually elected. And I think that the compromise will be found somewhere in the middle. I think the bottom line, though, is that democracy is good. Education is vitally important, and voters and parents should have a say in who represents them on the Chicago School Board.
And Representative Demmer, speaking of education, the governor announced that because of better than anticipated tax receipts, that the state will have enough money to give public schools increased aid under the new expanded aid formula. What does that mean for public school funding across the state?
I think it's a positive step for schools across the state of Illinois. You know, a couple of years ago, we got together and worked on a bipartisan education funding reform bill that pledged by the General Assembly to keep a commitment to adding additional dollars to local school districts. One, to make sure they have the resources they need, but also to ensure that local property tax payers aren't the primary source of funding K-12 education. So I think it's a step in the right direction. And I think really we should consider how this fits in with other federal relief dollars that some school districts have received, as well as what they're getting in local property tax support to ensure that we're making the appropriate investment in education.
So take those things into consideration when allocating the money. All right, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but we'll be joined again later in the program by these lawmakers to discuss ethics reforms, among a lot of other things. And now, our thanks to State Senator Jason Barackman and State Representatives Tom Demmer, Anna Moeller, and LaShawn Ford. And up next, a look inside the Jackson 5 family home with members Marlon and Tito. So please stay with us. And there is much more ahead on the program, including details on cases headed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But first, new hopes in the King of Pop's hometown for a revival of what was once a thriving community. Arts correspondent Angel Ito visited with some members of the Jackson 5 in an exclusive interview at their childhood home.
The celebration was in full force at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, as the city marked the home of the Jackson 5 with official highway signage.
They know Gary all over the world. And let's just put it on the map the way we should.
One woman drove from as far as Philadelphia to see Jackson 5 members Marlon and Tito in person and thank them for their impact on music.
Hey, I can't thank y'all enough for what y'all done, not just for me.
The sign will stand near a new Hard Rock Casino, a very recent addition to northern Indiana. Now, it's hoped that with the new signage in front of the Jackson family home, in addition to the new casino coming to Gary, that the city will see an economic recovery and get back on their feet.
Many years back, Gary was a thriving city. The communities and the people here go to the casino. The economic stability would change in this city with the dollars being spent, and you could use those dollars from the taxes to further develop. But it's time to bring this diamond in the rough back.
Gary's a great place, and everything that we accomplished in our past, right here at 2300 Jackson Street, it came from hard effort and work right here at this house.
So we're back at your childhood home. What memories is being here bringing back for you all?
I just remember the layout of the area. The houses are still here. The nosy neighbor across the street that used to tell on us all the time.
The street would stop right here, well, actually right there in the back, and it was gravel, and we would play back there, and just to think that all of us are conceived in this little bitty house.
How has COVID been for you all?
Tito has a new blues album that
I've been working, yeah, during the pandemic I put together a blues album, and I have some great music, blues music, and collaborations. I did a song with Joe Bonamassa, a song with George Benson, and I did a song with Stevie Wonder.
The highway signage is just one of many acknowledgments the world-famous family is working on to honor their childhood home.
Working on making it becoming a historical site, because people all over the globe, when they come to this area, Chicago, Gary, they want to come see the home that the Jackson 5s started, and which makes us feel good because it lets you understand and realize the blessing, the musical blessing that the Lord bestowed on this family, and what was the whole purpose of that blessing. Is bringing people together all over this globe in harmony and peace.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
And you can see that new signage on I-8094 in Gary, Indiana, right next to the Hard Rock Casino. If you're interested in visiting the historic home, that address is, you guessed it, 2300 Jackson Street. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, unpacking a major abortion law set to go in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. That and details on other cases facing the justices. Lawmakers weigh in on hammering out the new state budget, ethics reforms, and other big issues being debated in Springfield. And as daycare centers reopen, are kids coming back? How Illinois' child care industry is faring more than a year into the pandemic. But first, some more of today's top stories. Defunct metal scrapper General Iron's parent company sues the city, demanding a permit for its proposed Southside recycling facility. The controversial project has faced protests, including a hunger strike, over its potential environmental impact on the southeast side. Earlier this month, Mayor Lori Lightfoot indefinitely delayed the permit after the Environmental Protection Agency called for a review over civil rights concerns. The company says it's gone above and beyond city requirements for a permit and wants $100 million for lost profits and damages. A new Latino agenda for Illinois. A coalition of Latino leaders and organizations announced the Illinois Latino Agenda 2.0. This group is calling for equitable representation in government, business, and philanthropy, and equitable resources and treatment for Latino communities. Organizers noted that Latinos were the hardest hit group during the coronavirus pandemic and that many are essential workers.
As we emerge from this recovery, we seek investment to recover from the pandemic. We seek investment for our neighborhoods and for our schools that are struggling. We seek justice for those that have lost lives. We demand police accountability and reform. And we seek equity and justice for the Latino community from all sectors of society.
And now to Phil Ponce for a look at some of the cases that the Supreme Court is set to hear. Phil.
Paris, the U.S. Supreme Court announces it will take up a major case that some say could threaten abortion access across the country. The court will hear an appeal supporting a Mississippi law so far blocked by lower courts, which would ban most abortions at the 15th week of pregnancy. The decision comes as the court wraps up oral arguments in several cases involving free speech online, financial disclosures for charity donors, and more. Here to help us break it all down are Aziz Huq, a professor at the University of Chicago Law School and former clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Robert Hochman, co-lead of the Supreme Court and appellate practice at Sidley Austin, that's a law firm, and a former clerk for Justice Stephen Breyer, and Joseph Morris, a former Assistant Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan and attorney at the law firm Morris and De La Rosa. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Aziz Huq, this Mississippi law, which again would ban most abortions at the 15th week of pregnancy, do you see it as a challenge to Roe v. Wade, potentially?
Yes, the Mississippi law on its face is inconsistent with Roe, and more importantly, a 1993 case called Casey, which limits the state's authority to regulate abortion before the point of viability, which is between 23 and 26 weeks into the pregnancy.
So, Joe Morris, what does it tell you that the court has taken a case which could conceivably have reverberations that might impact Roe v. Wade?
Well, that's right. It's an important case. There is an entire spectrum of possible outcomes here. At one extreme, the court could attack the foundation of Roe versus Wade itself and overrule the proposition that this maternal right to an abortion is found in the Constitution. But there are any number of shadings of possible outcomes between there and where we are now. The narrowest a narrow way to frame the question here is, what's the meaning of the trimester regime and the viability standard, a completely judge-made standard grounded in no text of the Constitution or any statute? Is it possible for these judges to tweak the work of those judges and to say that it's possible for a legislature, by enacting a statute, to define the limits of the notion of viability?
Robert Hochman, do you see viability as a potential inroad into Roe v. Wade, that is to say, when a life begins?
Well, I think that's sort of essentially the question here. I don't know whether it's about when life begins exactly. I don't think that justices are going to wade into that kind of a philosophical question. But what makes that case so important and so potentially disruptive to what people think of when they think of Roe v. Wade, which is the right, the woman's right to make the choice to have an abortion, is that in the absence of the viability standard, we don't know what would be a constitutional basis for restricting states and what the lines that they could draw in determining when women are permitted or can lawfully be prohibited from having an abortion. So in the opposition to the request for the court to review the case, the proponents of the pro-choice advocates were very, very strict and clear that viability is a clear and proper standard. And now I think they have to go back to the drawing board and at least think, what else might there be? Because if viability is going to go by the by, then we don't know what would be put in its place.
Aziz Hook, the court doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's aware of, obviously, of what the political currents are in the country. And at this point, most polls show that most Americans, not necessarily an overwhelming majority, but a majority of Americans do support Roe v. Wade. Does that factor, how do those outside influences impact how a court rules?
Well, the court obviously exists in a political context. Critically, it's appointed by presidents and confirmed by senates that have political considerations in mind. And we would not be seeing the Dobbs case arise and be adjudicated in the way that it will be adjudicated in the absence of the appointments that we've seen in the last few years. However, the kind of present opinion poll data that you cited, I think has an extremely weak, if any, effect upon the court. The court is by design and in the operation of the justices themselves, reasonably well insulated from public opinion writ large. The court is much more sensitive to the opinion of political and legal elites.
Let's move on to another case that just wrapped up oral arguments, and this involves a cheerleader who was suspended from the cheer squad for posting profanities on social media after school hours. Joe Morris, how much does the person in question being a student and being off school grounds play a role here?
Well, it's huge. Now, I come down in a fairly libertarian way on this case. We have a prior Supreme Court decision known as Tinker. It involved an Iowa school district, the Des Moines school district, that confers upon school authorities pretty wide range of authority over what happens inside the schoolhouse, ability to regulate speech and conduct and so forth inside the schoolhouse, if that speech is of a disruptive nature. What's significant about this case is it involves speech that took place entirely outside the schoolhouse. It involves social media. To be clear, the student in question, a young cheerleader who was knocked off her cheerleading squad, said some rather obscene things, not about the school or about other students or teachers involved in the situation, but about the notion of cheerleading and the team and the like in general. She used the F word several times in her statement, not identifying in particular the school insofar as I'm aware of the facts. This is clearly entirely off-campus, out-of-school behavior. And in my view, this is a considerable overreach on the part of school authorities. What is at issue here is a First Amendment right, right of a citizen, even if a child, to speak in a setting that is not controlled by government authorities.
Robert Hochman, how about that? When one looks at technology and what anybody can say on the internet, is there really such a thing as on campus or off school grounds anymore?
I actually think that's the most interesting aspect of this case, and it might not be limited to the question of disciplining students in a school environment. That's the focus of the case, and I think there's a lot of attention focused on that for good reasons. But the question of social media speech in general, the fact that it takes place both nowhere and everywhere, was very much on the minds of the justices at argument, and that has potential implications in a lot of other areas of law beyond school discipline. There are employment-related implications there. There are public employment and otherwise. And this is something that the court, for the past 20 years or so, certainly since Chief Justice Roberts has been on the court, has really struggled with, sort of adapting old norms and cases and views about privacy and various other rights to the modern internet age. And this, I think, is going to be a significant step forward in that.
Aziz Huq, the court also took up a case involving a California law that requires charities to disclose their donors. Kind of a parallel, do you see a parallel to that in cases involving political contributions? Expand on that.
Well, the Supreme Court has struck down both federal and state laws that limit the expenditures and contributions that people can make either to political parties or to political candidates. In doing this, the court has repeatedly underscored that campaign finance regulation that concerns money is not necessary because states and the federal government can impose disclosure regulations. This was, for example, an important part of the Citizens United decision. The decision, or the case that's before the court, concerns California's requirement that charities give to the California Attorney General a part of their federal tax return that discloses their major donors. The worry that has been expressed by the state of California and by the federal government in respect to this case is that a decision that protects donors to a charity will be extended to disclosure rules that have previously been upheld in the campaign finance context, such that the justification for limits on expenditures and contributions will fall away. The state, that is, will be unable to regulate campaign finance directly, and it will be unable to use disclosure mandates to ensure that we, the citizens, understand who stands financially behind a party or a candidate.
3 tantalizing decisions. Maybe we'll have you back when those decisions are actually issued. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Robert Hochman, Aziz Huq, and Joseph Morris.
Thank you.
And now, Paris, we go back to you.
Thanks, Phil. Early in the program, we discussed the battle over remapping legislative districts, and now we're joined again by State Senator Jason Barackman, State Representatives Tom Demmer, Anna Moeller, and LaShawn Ford. Thanks for being back, everybody. Let's talk about the budget. Representative Ford, the governor has talked about closing $1 billion in corporate loopholes to close a $1.3 billion budget gap. Loopholes can be kind of a catch-all term. What are those specific loopholes, and how may it produce the money needed to close that gap?
The governor has proposed the budget cuts or corporate loopholes that we should agree on as a body, because there is a $1.3 billion deficit. So we talked earlier about funding K-12 education at a higher level. We can't do that if we don't find the money. And so the governor has talked about removing some of the federal tax breaks that have been given and handed down through the state, which is great. Capping the corporate deductions, that's great. Aligning the treatment of foreign sources as a means to cut corporate loopholes. I think we have to reset the tax credit scholarship fund for school districts. We have to look at that. Cap retail discounts. There's a lot of cuts or corporate loopholes that the governor is talking about rolling back, and we should look at them, and we should not be closed on them.
Senator Barackman, is this the best way to close that budget gap?
Well, first of all, I think the notion that there's a budget gap is a wild misnomer. And look, this is good news for the state. The reality is that the budget forecasts show that there's much more revenue coming into the state than was originally forecast. That's good news. It also means there's plenty of money. You add to that the fact that the federal government is providing, it was very controversial, but the reality is the federal government's providing about $8 billion in additional funds to the state. So what that means is there's plenty of money here. There's no need for tax increases, as the governor has proposed. There's no need. What the governor calls, loopholes and otherwise are things like scholarships for low-income students who attend failing schools. I think that's a disastrous policy to cut. We need to do more of that and support our kids in our schools, especially our low-income children that are in failing schools.
disagreement here on just what those corporate loopholes entail, or whether or not they're good or not. Representative Mueller, the state did get by on a lot of short-term borrowing through COVID, and now the U.S. Treasury is saying some of that $8 billion the state wants to use to pay down those debts. It's not allowed to use it to pay down debts. Do you think the state will be able to pay down these significant short-term debt obligations with some of that federal aid coming in?
Well, we don't know, and that's the problem. And so we can't budget as if we can. We have to assume that at this point that we're not going to be able to use that $8 billion to pay off debt. And we know that our backlog of bills is still in the multi-billion-dollar range, I believe somewhere around $6 billion. So the idea that that we don't have to make the wealthiest corporations in our state pay their fair share for vital public services, I think is disingenuous. And let's be honest, the corporate loopholes that we're talking about closing are not those that affect scholarships for kids. These are corporate loopholes that affect multi-billion-dollar international companies that have benefited, that were treated special under the Trump administration in his last tax cut when he was in office. And we're merely trying to decouple from that federal tax cut so that we can pay for education and for helping seniors and for helping the developmentally disabled access the services that they need. All services, all programs that have been in jeopardy and have been stressed during COVID, and because of the longstanding time under Rauner when we didn't have a budget in the state.
All right.
So there's a lot that we need to make up for, and a lot we need to invest in.
If history is a guide, we'll learn a lot about the budget at the 11th hour in Springfield before the session ends. I got to jump to the issue of ethics. The Commonwealth Edison bribery scandal has former ComEd lobbyists and an executive indicted, plus the former Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan. He's implicated, not charged in court documents. As a result, lawmakers are calling for ethics reforms.
This isn't just about a few outliers taking bribes or breaking rules. This is about fundamentally reforming the system that doesn't allow us to police our own house. I believe it's un-American, it's unfair, and it's just fundamentally wrong.
Representative Demmer, I mean, they're competing ethics proposals here, but a base issue is trying to prevent lawmakers from becoming lobbyists right after they step down from their legislative career. Will there be an ethics bill that tackles that?
There certainly should be. This ethics issue has been brewing in Springfield for more years than most of us can count. And time again, we've come to the table with specific legislative proposals to try to change the culture of corruption in Springfield. Even more fundamental than the question of whether legislators can be when they leave is a question of whether a legislator can be a lobbyist while they're currently in office. That practice is allowed today. That practice directly led to legal troubles for a former representative. And it's a practice that I sought to stop with a bill that I introduced in the House last year. Unfortunately, in this long drawn-out process of trying to water down ethics reforms, those proposals have never been given a vote. They've been set aside with the idea that some larger bill was coming at a later date. The danger in all this, though, is that the more time that elapses between the jaw-dropping arrests that happen, the bombshell reports that come through, the more opportunity there is for people who want to see the status quo preserved to water down those reforms. We need serious ethics reform in Springfield, and the time is now for that to happen.
All right, there's a lot on your plate. There's only a few weeks left in session. We'll see how this all shakes out. But for now, our thanks to State Senator Jason Barackman and State Representatives Tom Demmer, Anna Moeller, and LaShawn Ford. A lot of things took a pause during the pandemic, including enrollment of kids in child care services. So that meant more parents were left balancing work and caretaking responsibilities while also navigating economic uncertainty. And now as child care centers reopen, some families appear slow to enroll their kids. Joining us to discuss how child care and youth programs have been impacted are Sonia Crum-Knight, Vice President of Programs and Impact at Carol Robertson Center for Learning, and that serves communities across Chicago with 2 locations on the west side. And April Janney, President and CEO of Illinois Action for Children. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. First, you're welcome. First with you, April. Just tell us how the child care industry has been impacted over the last year as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, we know initially that a number of child care providers had to close because of the shutdown period, and except for those that were serving essential workers, that we had to work to get them open and being able to serve essential workers, basically, who had to go to work. Impact overall was with attendance and enrollment decreasing, overall loss of employment for those parents who had to leave work, and for child care providers who had staff who had to leave. And so the overall employment loss. But then being at home for those parents who could work from home, having to juggle parenting, teaching, and working remotely became a big challenge, and keeping that income coming into their home.
So a big impact on families and also on workers at child care centers. Sonia, how were the communities that you serve impacted, both the families and then the workers?
Yes, well, COVID exposed existing vulnerabilities and historic systemic inequities, right? So our staff are part and parcel of the communities we serve. They come from those communities, so they were deeply impacted, as were our families. Our families, though, are the essential workforce, so we started thinking about reopening as soon as we closed. And we were sure to curate the most recent research from the CDC and guidance from the Chicago Department of Public Health and the Illinois Department of Public Health to make a plan for reopening safely. Throughout the pandemic, I think it's important to note that we kept our employees whole. We immediately switched to a virtual framework for service to our children and families because we needed to maintain some level of service to a community that depends on us to be there every day. So in addition to virtual spaces for connecting, we also did a Monday distribution of essential materials, supplies, as well as learning materials.
So a lot of your families, essential workers that can't exactly work from home and take care of their children, they have to go to their jobs. So those virtual programs, I'm sure, came in handy. April, as we mentioned at the top, things are reopening, but you're not necessarily seeing a lot of families and kids come back in. Is that correct?
Yes, I think in some cases a lot of parents are nervous about health concerns with exposing their children, and those children coming back to their households and maybe exposing them and people that they have to care for in their homes. But also teachers are as concerned about their health and the exposure that may have on their families as well. So there's that nervousness, that tension about keeping everyone safe, as Sonia said.
And Sonia, you know, a significant portion of the workers in this industry are women, are black and brown. Are they able to come back to their jobs? And are there enough candidates to meet the demand of jobs in this industry? Because we hear there might be a skills gap out there.
Yes, well, the Carol Robertson Center for Learning has a long legacy of growing our own. So we are always actively recruiting those that may be interested in a career in early learning and youth development, and we work closely with them to build those skills and get the requisite education and state credentials. And we took good care of our employees. I think that it's really important to stay grounded in the science, to be transparent and foster two-way communication, and to lead with dignity, right? We listen to the fears, we listen to the concerns of both our parents and our staff, and that was really important for us.
And April, Jaddy, you know, as you know, President Biden has proposed big-time federal funding for child care relief for families. How might that impact families here in Chicago and families that your organizations serve?
I think for families, it helped them to cover the cost of child care that they need and being able to find places where they could pay for that, as well as with the child care providers being able to not have to receive these interruption grants so that they can have and bring staff back to capacity and sustain the requirements to meet the PPE and the additional cleaning, along with their fixed costs. Because right now, Well, maybe soon, but right now they're not operating at full capacity. So you have a limited number of kids who can be in the space, which means that they're not getting their full income from the slots that they could fill.
And Sonia, as we know, in the latest federal relief bill, families got $1,400 checks or more if they had kids. Have you seen that go toward child care costs?
Well, I can't really speak to, those that much needed support going to child care costs, but I would imagine for our essential worker families who receive the state-funded child care assistance program, which also requires a copay, if you will, a small percentage based on income that they have to pay, I would imagine that that infusion of much needed resources definitely helped to cover that.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Our thanks to Sonia Crumnight and April Janney. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be back to wrap things up in just a bit, but first, a look at the weather. And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Confusion over mask-wearing guidelines. Our Spotlight Politics team breaks that down and more. And a curious bear describes a Chicago puppeteer's experience with racial profiling. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a law firm with human interests and numerous community involvement initiatives.